Hello, welcome to Kashmir TV. Thanks for watching another video on our leaders, where we will be covering pretty much all of the major world leaders as of this year. I appreciate you joining me on this journey, where I hope you will learn a lot about many of these great individuals and perhaps instill some of their best features within yourself, and as well as I develop in character through my learnings as well, which I am in effect reflecting through this video series. So without further ado, we will begin with Mark Rutte, the leader of the Netherlands, and Mohammed bin Salman, the leader of or the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. Once again, the reason for the order, I'm not saying that Mark Rutte is in any way superior or inferior to Mohammed bin Salman. The order is just done in terms of GDP. The Netherlands, as of today, their GDP is slightly larger than that of Saudi Arabia. So without further ado, we shall begin with Mark Rutte of the Netherlands. So Mark Rutte is a Dutch politician. People in the Netherlands are called Dutch, if you didn't know that. Not Deutschland, which is Germany, but Dutch. He's the current Prime Minister of the Netherlands. He is the first Liberal Prime Minister in 92 years. So we'll extrapolate on that further, but something early on to note. He has first came into this position in 2010, and he has been a leader of the People's Party for Freedom and Democracy, the VVD party, since 2006, which is a liberal party. Many of the parties within the Netherlands are liberal, however, they are liberal from an economic standpoint, liberal from a cultural standpoint, and liberal from a social perspective as well. So therefore, he is considered the first liberal prime minister in 92 years. So with respect to his early life, he was born in The Hague, which is in South Holland. It's the third largest city in the Netherlands after Amsterdam and Rotterdam. However, it should be noted that Rotterdam is pretty close to The Hague, so the greater metropolitan area is actually the 13th largest in the EU. The Hague is the seat of the cabinet in the Netherlands, as well as the General Supreme Court, or the States General, and the Supreme Court, as well as the Council of State. But technically the capital is still Amsterdam. However, in all intensive purposes, all of the most major governmental bodies are in The Hague. But even perhaps more importantly, from a global standpoint, The Hague is known as the home of the international law and justice, as the International Criminal Court of Justice has been there since 1946 at the end of the Second World War. And additionally, the International Criminal Court was founded in The Hague as well in 2002. So I think this is important to note, that he was born in a very global city, probably the second most global city in the world. Perhaps Brussels could be considered the first, not from a demographic standpoint, but in terms of their influence on the European Union, which is probably the most major collective global body. As in Brussels, that is where the executive and legislative major bodies are of the European Union. So The Hague is essentially where the judicial branch is kept, which is actually, I think it's important that the judicial head is kept separate from the executive and legislative branch. But nonetheless, despite the International Criminal Court only being established in 2002, the International Court of Justice has been in The Hague for a very long time, and throughout all of Rutte's life. So it is likely that the international presence in The Hague definitely had an influence on his upbringing and his perhaps firstly passion for ultimately going into politics, but also his understanding of the European Union and the global community as a whole. His family comes from a Dutch Reform. They're called a Dutch Reform family, which is the largest Christian sect in the Netherlands. They are Protestant. A little bit more about the Protestant Reformation caused by Martin Luther, a really great book on that. Not specifically just about Martin Luther, but he has a really great biography of Martin Luther is General Stanley McChrystal in his book Leaders, which is very much made in a similar style to this video series where every individual is done in pairs. He pairs up Martin Luther with Martin Luther King Jr., but nonetheless, it's also a Plutarchian style with two pairs and then a comparison at the end. But nonetheless, I think it's a really great biography on Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. But nonetheless, he comes from, I guess you could consider, from a religious standpoint, a majority group in the Netherlands, but also his family comes from a Protestant background, which is has roots in sort of passing aside some of dogmatism and tradition. He's the youngest child of Isaac Rutte, who died in 1998 when Mark Rutte was only 21 years old. So that's not too young to lose a father, but at 21 years old, I think that would lead one to, at a somewhat younger age, to take more responsibility over their own life. His father was a merchant who originally was an importer in the Dutch East Indies, so he actually was in the new land importing goods. So his father obviously had traveled across the Atlantic Ocean and had seen much of the world, and he ultimately also became a director back in the Netherlands, so he returned back, but died pretty young from Mark Rutte. His mother is still alive today, and she served as his secretary as well, so obviously a very competent woman as well. He studied at Meerland Lyceum from 1979 to 1985, which is a high school essentially, where he specialized in arts. He had dreams of becoming a concert pianist, so obviously he has a passion for the arts. A cool a thought on the arts, which I had never really thought of it, and obviously it comes from Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf, which obviously don't assume I'm some neo-Nazi for having read the book, but I think it's important that everyone reads it. But nonetheless, Adolf Hitler says, of all the sectors in the world, the arts is the only one that is not controlled by bureaucracy. So at the time, particularly when he was growing up in Germany, well, he was born in Austria, but since he did not have a prestigious university education, he saw arts as the only way that people from the lower classes could rise to the very highest ranks. And I think we still see that today. I think part of the foundations of the hip-hop movement demonstrated that people from some of the most impoverished regions of the United States could climb to the very highest echelon of society, such as someone such as Jay-Z, whereas if Jay-Z wanted to go into perhaps almost any other industry, despite his incredible talent, it would have been nearly impossible. So that is just something, a little digression on the importance of the arts. But nonetheless, he was also a good student as well, so instead he actually went on to study history at Leiden University, where he achieved a Master's of Arts in 1992 when he was 25 years old. So he continued on his bachelor's to a master's, so obviously had enjoyed academia, or at least did not see much reason to leave it. Leiden University is considered probably the third best university in the country, after Wageningen University and the University of Amsterdam being number 1 and 2 respectively. Another notable mention would be Erasmus in Rotterdam, which I know has a great business program. Some of my friends had gone there. However, I would like to note that from my perspective, I think that Leiden might actually be number 1 because they have alumni such as Spinoza and René Descartes, both of whom I have made biographies on, which I really recommend that you watch. Two very, very important philosophers. And Leiden University is also the oldest in the Netherlands as well, and also had a large influence on Albert Einstein. So I think particularly perhaps for history, maybe it would have been the best choice for him. So nonetheless, I think he went to a very, very top university and was very, very well educated. After his education, during his education, he served as a position on the board of the youth organization Freedom and Democracy, which was pretty much the youth counterpart to the VVD party, which he would later go on to head and win their first majority victory. Similar to Angela Merkel, Angela Merkel had a very prominent involvement in the youth organizations when she was younger. So he was involved with the VVD party very early, which I think, unlike Merkel, because Merkel was involved in the Socialist Party at the time, where it wasn't that she was forced to do it, but serious repercussions would have been placed upon her if she did not join it. The VVD party had never been very successful. As we see, he ultimately becomes the first liberal prime minister in 92 years. So he obviously saw something in the VVD party and decided to commit himself to it quite early. He even became chair of this youth organization from 1988 to 1991, from the years 21 to 24 years old. So very early political involvement, especially with the VVD party, which obviously I think starts alluding to his interest in liberalism and that party specifically. After his education, he went into the private sector, where he worked in business for the food subsidiary Calvé of Unilever. Unilever is a very major British-Dutch corporation. Many of my friends work at Unilever, and particularly an individual who came from Unilever that recently just inspired me quite a bit was Dietrich Messerschmitt. He is the founder of Red Bull, which I think is a very, very fascinating company to study, because it pretty much came out of nowhere, took a small product from East Asia, and he went on to become a billionaire. So he worked originally in marketing. His first job was with Unilever, and he worked as also for Procter & Gamble, but as a marketing executive. However, in the case of Mark Rutte, he was actually in the human resources department pretty much his whole career in the private sector in business. He became a manager in human resources and the leader, and he led in major human resources positions through many reorganizations within the company, both at Calvé and Unilever as a whole. From 1997 to 2000, when he was 30 to 33 years old, he became a manager at Vanderburg, Amsterdam, or Vanderburg, Netherlands, which is also a subsidiary of Unilever, and once again, he was in a human resources role. In 2000, he became a member of the Corporate Human Resources Group, which is a larger body that oversees human resources within multiple private enterprises. Then he became an HR manager at Inglo Mora Group, which is also a Unilever subsidiary, in 2002 at 35 years old. So what does this all mean? Firstly, I think from either in terms of the people he was working with and the people who selected him in his role, he was very good at people. So firstly, he was obviously good enough at being in HR, because a big part of the role of HR is recruitment and also ultimately ethics and that sort of thing. He was very good in these roles, but also I think the people above him also saw that he was also really good with people as well, to allow him to keep moving up and keep moving from place to place. But also, to take the other side of the argument, it seems strange that he kept jumping from subsidiary to subsidiary. Perhaps this is a common practice for Unilever, or perhaps it's just because he essentially was a jack of all trades that was just good at people and could be moved as seemed fit for any aspect of the Unilever business, regardless of what specific part of the CPG that he was covering. From 1993 to 1997, he was continued during these periods while he was working in HR for various subsidiaries of Unilever. He was continued to be a member of the VVD national board. Later, he became a member of the candidate committee during the 2002 election. So during this election, Jan-Peter Balkenende, who was the prime minister at the time, who came from the Christian Democratic Appeal Party, the CDA, who ultimately made many coalitions with the VVD party later in Mark Rutte's career. So what happened with him was the VVD party and Jan Peter Balken's party needed to form a coalition, as is always the case in Netherlands. It won the VVD a few seats in the cabinet, and since Mark Rutte had such a great business acumen and had such a long involvement with the VVD, he was appointed State Secretary for Social Affairs and Employment, which is very fitting because he has such an extensive career in human resources. Why not be State Secretary for Social Affairs and Employment? In 2003, he was soon after serving in this role, he was elected as a Member of Parliament in the House of Representatives, which is essentially the House of Commons in the Netherlands. And with that, in 2004, he became State Secretary for Education, Culture, and Science. An important parallel to draw here was that both Duque, Ivan Duque, of the leader of Colombia, and Mette Frederiksen, the leader of Denmark, they both were leaders of culture. So it's important to note that he was also a leader of culture as well. In 2006, he became in the Dutch municipal elections. The VVD suffered heavy losses, and the leader Josias van Arsten had to resign. Therefore, Mark Rutte won the leadership of the election and resigned from his cabinet position at that time. So at 2006, he became the leader of the VVD party, which he had been involved with since his university studies in the youth organization. In the 2006 general election, weeks later, just after becoming the head of the party, despite the VVD party losing 6 seats, they became the largest opposition party in the Netherlands. So historically, relatively a big success for the VVD party, and likely due to Mark Rutte's success. The VVD, just for some further background, as I said, is the major liberal party. They advocate for free markets and private enterprises. And after 1974, they kind of switched to a more populist focus. Populism obviously gets a bad rep, but essentially I think the VVD is just trying to most align themselves with the needs of the most people, almost like a utilitarianism perspective from the top down. So I think that the reason why Mark Rutte and the VVD party is so successful today, and since he came into power, is because they really are starting to become populist and really listening to what the people want, and that's following the trend towards liberalization and private enterprise. In the 2010 elections, he won the highest number of votes cast for the House of Representatives for the first time in VVD history, and then he became the first Liberal Prime Minister in 92 years, and the second youngest Prime Minister in Dutch history. The VVD party had to form a coalition with the CDA, who he had former relations with, and the PVDA. Unfortunately, the coalition with the PVDA failed, and Queen Beatrix had to find multiple intermediaries to decide on who the coalition should be formed between, and ultimately they found a coalition with the center-right Christian Democrats and Party of Freedom. So ultimately, in the Netherlands, it is always essentially a coalition government that has to rule. So it's it's extra democratic, one might say, but almost at the disadvantage of the country. For example, this case, it took a very, very long time for the coalition to be formulated, and similarly in his next election, it almost becomes burdensome the time it takes. The PVV is the most ardent supporter of economic liberalism, classical liberalism, and cultural liberalism. However, they still support the Netherlands as a welfare state. Another welfare state, for example, is Canada, the country I grew up in. I think universal basic income might be a bit extreme, but Canada is a welfare state, so if I wanted to never work a day in my life, I could just pick up welfare checks, and that is something that is covered in Canada, and that's something that's covered in Netherlands. This is something that Mark Rutte still supports, but it's something that the general trend in the Netherlands is moving away from, at least overly social policies. The government unfortunately collapsed in the early April due to a 2012 budget talks as they froze. However, in the 2012 elections, the VVD party still won with the highest seats ever in the history of the Netherlands, or in their history, and they formed a coalition with the Labour Party. So, interestingly enough, after this 2012 election, this was actually the first time that a party had filled a complete term in the Netherlands. So I think that's quite interesting to note. So although in 2012 they had to pull out of their government, this is pretty much the case in every government in the Netherlands. So not only is it so difficult to form the coalitions, it's hard to maintain. So it's almost, one might argue, too democratic, if such a word is not criminal to say, in the Netherlands. In 2017, they lost some seats in the general election. However, they still remained the largest party for and for a record long period. And they formed a coalition between the VVD party, his party, the CDA, their most common and former ally, and the Christian Union, who are a bit more conservative. They are against same-sex marriage. And as well the D66 party, which was founded in 1966 and are more social liberal. So he began his third term in the October 26th of 2017, and that is the term that he is still serving as of this date. With respect to his personal life, he is a big fan of Robert Caro, and particularly his writing about Robert Moses, the power broker, which seems like a very fascinating book that I would very much like to read, and I plan on reading it very soon. I imagine firstly, I think we should not criticize Mark Rutte for liking this, because obviously it is a book about power. It's about an individual who gained a lot of power and learned how to manipulate people. But I don't think just because someone reads something, that doesn't necessarily mean they are the product of it or believe it. For example, I've read the Communist Manifesto, and I think everyone should read the Communist Manifesto, but that does not mean everyone who's read the Communist Manifesto is a socialist or a communist. So nonetheless, I think he likes the books, but I think he's fascinated in the concept of power broking, which is very important in the EU particularly. Angela Merkel is considered the world's biggest power broker, or perhaps he just likes it for its literary style. He's, as mentioned earlier, he's part of the Dutch Protestant Church, and he's been a continuous supporter of it throughout his whole life. Interestingly enough, he is still single today. He's 53 years old, which is quite old to still be single. He's not an old person, but it's strange for most world leaders. But a couple parallels we could draw are that Shinzo Abe, the leader of Japan, and Modi of India, both have no children, which obviously has rendered them more time to dedicate to their leadership. Perhaps the same could be said for Mark Rutte. He's just too busy to find himself a partner or to invest in children. He still teaches 1 hour a week at a secondary school called Johan de Witt College in The Hague, which I think is a nice thing to do. So despite not having children, I think he cares for children, and he's still having an impact on the children of the Netherlands. He abolished a 15% dividend tax, which was lobbied by major companies such as Unilever and Royal Dutch Shell, which is another major British Dutch company. The problem with this was, firstly, I think it could be expected of his party because they're pro-privatization, a little bit more liberal from an economic standpoint. However, he did not tell the voters that they should be expecting this decrease in dividend tax. So it was a little bit, many people in the Netherlands were upset with this. He was criticized for his typical Dutch bluntness, they say, for in a meeting with Donald Trump. He continued to interrupt Donald Trump and went on many monologues and even contradicted Donald Trump at times, so he was considered to have be blunt. Perhaps it's not a bad thing, though. I think it's important for any world leader to speak their mind, and if he doesn't speak up, who else can from the Netherlands? So I think that's important. Obviously, it can be of bad taste sometimes, but if you're a world leader, like, I suppose you might actually have that right. He supported the Levant Front in Syria in 2018 by providing them with materials. This has been criticized because they're considered a jihadist group and who hope to form a caliphate state. So this has been heavily criticized. I don't think he's a terrorist supporter, but I suppose he has his own reasons. So moving on to the quotes and a little bit of background about the country. So the country, here's the flag of the Netherlands, the Dutch flag. The population is 17.28 million, so not very large. There are some cities that are larger than that. Tokyo has about 36 million, so much larger. However, their GDP is 913.7 billion, which is really quite massive. Especially for the population. That could be attributed to, as two of the images here, major corporations such as Unilever, which is British and Dutch, and Royal Dutch Shell, which is British and Dutch as well. The area is also quite small at only 41,553 kilometers squared, which is rather small. However, for the population, it could be considered a good size. Here is the seal or the symbol of the Hague, where he was born. Here is the symbol of the equivalent of the House of Commons in the Netherlands. This bottom one here. Here is the symbol of his university, Leiden University, and here are the symbol of two major corporations in the Netherlands, Unilever and Royal Dutch Shell. As for the quotes, I will make the VVD a party for everyone and not just the elite. So that's perhaps why he was the first Liberal Prime Minister, in that the VVD was obviously pro-private corporations and a bit more right-wing. However, he managed to bring it to the mainstream. A good thing about the IMF is there is no European politics involved. I think this belief might come a bit from his growing up in The Hague, in that obviously I think it's important that the judiciary branch be completely independent of the rest of the European Union, and other bodies such as the International Monetary Fund need to have autonomy. Otherwise, the European Union, already a strong body, could become relatively too powerful. The Netherlands and the UK are both seafaring nations, and so our ability to create jobs and to generate future growth is built on the free market. Once again, his proponents or support for free trade, globalization, and the free market. And also, I think it's a testament to the history of the Netherlands. The Netherlands has historically been a major seafaring nation, as evidenced by his own father, who went to the Dutch West Indies. And last quote, it shouldn't be the asylum seekers wondering which country they want to go to. It should be Europe telling them where to be it Lithuania, Sweden, or whatever. So I think this is not an outright anti-migration into the European Union. However, firstly, he does not mention the Netherlands as one of the countries they should come to. So I think he's a little bit more of a conservative with respect to refugees seeking asylum in the European Union. And I think he does, not to paint too big of a picture of him with respect to this, I think he does, he is a little bit less pro in favor of seeing refugees come to the Netherlands. Or, yeah. So without further ado, we'll move on to Mohammed Salman, and then we'll go into the comparison at the end. So Mohammed bin Salman is actually only the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. King Salman is the king. However, in all intents and purposes, King Mohammed, or MBS as he is colloquially referred to, is the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. Similar to, I think, another parallel we could draw here was in our video or discussion on Thailand. Technically, they have a king. However, there's been a coup, and Prayut Chan-o-cha is in effect the leader of Thailand as of today. So a little bit of and similarly, with the United Kingdom, we went with Boris Johnson, not Queen Elizabeth, because in all intents and purposes, Boris Johnson does hold the power as of now. So he was born on the 31st of August 1985. I'd like to know the month because anyone else who was born in August like me is just another reason to connect myself with. I do think maybe it's just in my head. I've never run the numbers, but I do think there seems to be a lot of leaders in the world who were born in August, but don't quote me on that. He is currently the Deputy Prime Minister. His father, King Salman, holds the Prime Minister title. However, in all intents and purposes, the MBS or Mohammed acts as the Prime Minister. He is the chairman of the Council for Economic Development Affairs, which he actually created. As we see, is very diversifying the economy in Saudi Arabia and promoting technology. He's also Minister of Defense. When he came into this position, he was the youngest at the time, and he's gotten into quite a bit of disputes in only the short period of time that he has already been in it. He's considered to be the power behind the throne. Originally, he got this position as King Salman appointed him Crown Prince after Mohammed bin Nayef, who is MBS's cousin, was removed from all his positions. We'll get into more detail with that, but I think there was perhaps maybe some moral issues we could discuss as well. So he is the eldest son of King Salman, King Salman's third spouse, so not necessarily his eldest son. His spouse Fadha bin Hatlin, who is the granddaughter of the head of Al-Amman tribe. So his mother came from a pretty important background, particularly before his own lineage claimed the absolute royal powers over the kingdom. He received a bachelor's degree from King Saud University, which is considered the #1 university in Saudi Arabia. It's located in Riyadh, the largest city and the capital, where he was also born. It's named after his grandfather, King Saud, and actually, coincidentally, the second best university, King Abdulaziz University, was named after his great-grandfather. So he couldn't have really gone wrong going to the first or second, but I think since he's part of the royal family, he could have gone in wherever he wanted, and I think he probably just wanted to stay in Riyadh, and his career was already essentially set up for him. He spent some short years in the private sector. However, he quickly moved to be a personal aide to his father, who at the time was not yet king, but the governor of Riyadh, which he served from 1963 to 2011. His father only became king in 2015, so and in effect, MBS or Mohammed Al-Salman did not expect to have the power he did until only very recently as well. During this time, he also consulted for the Export Commission for the Saudi cabinet. So obviously, I think we don't want to discount that he does have great ability, but his links to the royal family definitely helped him to rise very quickly. He became, in this order, Secretary General of Riyadh Competitive Council, to Special Advisor to the Chairman of the Board for King Abdulaziz, Foundation for Research and Archives, and then to a member of the Board of Trustees for Riyadh Reason for Al-Bir Society. In 2011, Sultan bin Abdulaziz died, who was the king at the time, so King Salman became Defense Minister and second Deputy Prime Minister. So Sultan bin Abdulaziz was was the king at the time, but then it passed on to King Salman's brother at the time, and this put King Salman, or MBS, I think at this point it's better to refer to him as MBS because both him and his father have the same last name, but MBS's father became second in line to the throne after the throne itself. And he became defense minister, and Mohammed, MBS, became his father's private advisor. In 2012, Crown Prince Nayef bin Abdulaziz died as well, and King Salman became the crown prince, so first in line in the throne, and first deputy prime minister, so essentially the leader of the country, but still not king, second in line as his brother was serving. At this point, Muhammad began remarking in his own image. So by this, it's noted that before this time, before 2012, MBS would always refer to my father says this or my superior says this, but at this point he really started exerting his own actual beliefs. In 2013, Saul bin Nayef was appointed governor of the Eastern Province, and he was once thought to actually be king, and Muhammad succeeded in his post as chief of the Crown Prince Court. So a little bit of a power switch here, and this is likely because MBS's father, King Salman, was getting much more powerful and paving the way for his own son. In 2014, on April 25th, became state minister as well, so a very powerful position. In January 23rd of 2015, King Abdullah died, the brother of King Salman, and King Salman took the throne. And Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, was appointed Minister of Defense, his father's former position, and Secretary General of the Royal Court, and maintained his position as Minister of the State. So with this, he became essentially third in power, or second in line to the throne. So in his time as Minister of Defense, he's already, this has only been since 2014, had quite a few disputes, and that you're probably likely familiar with too, but I'll still discuss them here. So Yemen started to have some political unrest, originally started in 2004, but really started escalating in 2011 when the rebel group, the Houthis, took control of northern Yemen in late 2014. President Abdurrabru of Mansour Hadi and his cabinet of Yemen resigned. The first move that MBS took was to mobilize the GCC coalition, which was a group of countries or defense industries in the Middle East against the Houthi group. And they engaged in airstrikes against the rebel Houthis as well as a naval blockade. Similarly, in 2015, he led a coalition against the Houthis for seizures of Sona and began forcing their government into exile. He wanted Hadi, who was formerly the leader of Yemen, back into power and planned to swiftly get rid of the Houthis. However, this has not proven to be the case, and it has been long drawn out, and his boycott towards the Yemen economy has really hurt the people of Yemen. In April of 2015, soon after, Mohammed bin Nayef, who was Mohammed's cousin, MBS's cousin, became and was at the time crown prince, and MBS became deputy crown prince, so officially third in power and second in line to the throne under the king's decree. And this also gave him, at this time, MBS came into control of Saudi Aramco. Here's the symbol of Saudi Aramco, which is pretty much a state-run oil company. However, since they have the largest oil supply in the world, they sort of get to fix the prices of the global economy, or at least the global oil economy. So a very, very powerful position. In late 2015, he broke protocol and made a monologue criticizing the U.S. foreign policy on a meeting with Obama. So I think a parallel could be drawn with Mark Rutte, who criticized Donald Trump by criticizing him. MBS went on a monologue directly in front of Obama. However, it must be noted that Mark Rutte did it against Donald Trump. However, MBS did it against Obama. So similar action, but perhaps a different reason, or indicative of a different political stance. In 2015, he established the Islamic Military Counterterrorism Coalition, the IMCTC, which began its first meeting in Riyadh in 2017, and it included defense ministers and officials from 41 different countries, so actually quite supported. A little bit of background about the Yemen conflict. So the Houthis are mostly Zaidi Shia, which is an exclusive Shia sect to Yemen. Yemen they also have some Sunni members as well. Yemen is predominantly 75% Sunni, which is similar to the case, if not even more, the case in Saudi Arabia. So I think, at least from a religious standpoint, they would have reason to want to see Yemen succeed. However, Yemen seems to be struggling a lot as well. However, Islamic State is also a Sunni extremist group, and they are about have similar religious alignment to that of Saudi Arabia. They're about 75. Saudi Arabia is about 75 to 85% Sunni, or 10 to 15% Shia. So there, as we'll see soon, the MBS does not support Islamic State. However, some say that Saudi might be in some ways financing or supporting Islamic State. However, I think something that could be noted about MBS is that he is not a dire Sunni. He does not support one people just because they are Sunni, or not support one people because they are Shia. He has other reasons behind him. In fact, we could make the argument that he's more of a nationalist than a religious adherent. In 2017 of June, moving forward a little bit, Mohammed bin Nayef, his cousin, was deposed of by King Salman. So, as mentioned, King Salman had been king at this point. It was thought that, so Mohammed bin Nayef is the son of King Salman's brother, so King Salman's nephew, and in effect he probably should have the right to be king. However, I guess a good way to the youngest son chose his son over his elder brother's son to be king. So a little bit of at least King Salman, obviously, but this could be it could be from the perspective of merit. It could be that MBS is superior to his cousin Mohammed bin Nayef. However, it could just be that King Salman prefers his own son over his nephew. So nonetheless, I think the answer, maybe in the details, was not only was Mohammed bin Nayef denied his right as crown prince, he was removed from all of his roles. So you could make the argument that it was just through merit, but I think the fact that Mohammed bin Nayef, who should essentially be crown prince, was removed from all roles might be indicative of the fact that there was a little bit more than just reasons based on merit there. So nonetheless, MBS became crown prince and heir to the throne, and he is still in that position. However, right now he is the de facto leader thanks to his father. Donald Trump congratulated him on his recent elevation, and they have mentioned that they aim to discuss recent diplomatic dispute with Qatar, which we will discuss very soon, as well as peace between Israel and Palestine, where he actually has a little bit of a divergent opinion with respect to the United States, and lastly, to decrease terrorism generally in the Middle East, which also the U.S. does align with. He said in the Washington Post article that if it weren't for America's cultural influence, and here is the quote here, we would have ended up like North Korea. So he does actually admire in some ways the United States, and I think what he means for their cultural influence is particularly with respect to the private sector, where our first parallel could be seen with Mark Rutte, is that MBS really does support the private sector and believes in diversifying the industry, not just being a country solely based on oil, and also a big focus on technology, as he very much admires the Silicon Valley. In 2017, it's called the 2017 Purge, he put 200 wealthy businessmen on house arrest in the Riyadh Ritz-Carlton. Obviously, the Ritz-Carlton's a pretty nice hotel, but the point was that he was cracking down on corruption, but some say that this was an act of corruption itself. Here's the second quote here. I confirm to you, no one will survive in a corruption case, whoever he is, even if he's a prince or minister. So he's really cracking down on many powerful people, and in effect showing centralization, flexing his own muscles and showing that even other princes have no power over him. In December of 2017, he criticized the United States recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. In 2018, he condemned Benjamin Netanyahu, his intention to annex West Bank, and in September of 2019, their intentions to annex it in September of 2019, and however, he does state that he supports a Jewish homeland, and he's the first senior royal from Saudi Arabia not to recognize Israel, however. So jumping to the last quote here and then a discussion on this. So I believe the Palestinians and the Israelis have the right to have their own land. So that is something that I do believe. The United States actually doesn't recognize Palestine as a country, which I think is wrong. And from a personal standpoint, when I was a little bit younger, I think in 2013, I went to Israel, and I went to the West Bank, which Israel is trying to annex. I went to Jericho, Bethlehem supposedly where Jesus was born. But one thing that really surprised me, and this was, I was a bit younger then, but our drivers informed us that just as we were driving around West Bank, which is actually very, very safe. I think the picture painted by the West is that West Bank is shooting missiles and kidnapping Israelis all the time. However, that's just not the case. I think that might be characteristic of Gaza, which is on the other side of Israel. They are obviously firing missiles, but West Bank is very peaceful. And Benjamin Netanyahu's intention to annex it, I do not think is fair. But going back to the anecdote, I was informed that the movie Schindler's List is banned in Israel, which is something that I found very strange, because Schindler's List, if anything, is something that I think any Jewish person should watch, because it very much shows the cruelties of Nazi Germany and such. But the reason is that in Israel, they're building colonies in West Bank. So, and what they've done is they build these colonies where Jewish people or Israelis move into the West Bank, which is in effect Palestinian territory, and they build these little colonies, and they cut down all of the olive trees, which from almost all religious texts is a sacred tree, but they cut down all the olive trees to shoot them down, and this colonization is and this cruelty is shown as quite a parallel to Schindler's List, and therefore it's not even allowed to be viewed in Israel, as it's considered, one might view their actions as hypocritical. But obviously, I think I agree with MBS's argument. Both the Palestinians and Israelis have a right to their own land. And I think Benjamin Netanyahu's acts to further encroach on Palestinian territory is quite cruel. I think that it's a very tough situation, because the Jewish people have suffered so much hardships throughout history. However, I think the actions that they are doing is just as cruel as some of the things that they've gone through. Do I think that Jerusalem should go back to Palestine? I do not. I do not think so. Do I think that Jerusalem should be considered the capital of Israel? Well, it is the capital as of now. I don't necessarily think it should be. I think it should probably be considered a shared capital. One point in favor of the Israeli argument is that Jerusalem is the most holy site for Jerusalem, whereas Mecca is the most holy site for Muslims. So perhaps from an importance standpoint, Jewish people would think they might have right over the land, but then the same argument might be made for the Christians as well. So I just think I think it's a very, very difficult situation. But I do not think, and I stand by MBS's argument, that I do not think Benjamin Netanyahu has the right to further annex territory, at least. At least it's kind of keep things as they are and try to bring down tensions and break down the barriers and allow this place of religious importance to be shared rather than create more violence and such. So I actually think MBS has a good and well-grounded argument here. In March of 2018, he claimed that Turkey was the triad of evil alongside Iran. Iran has historically been a major enemy of Saudi Arabia, as well as the Sunni extremist group founded in Egypt known as the Brotherhood. So the triad of evil, according to MBS, is Turkey, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Iran. But I think the important thing to note here is that the Muslim Brotherhood is Sunni. So once again, I don't think MBS is just focusing on religious aspects, because if that were the case, he would support the Muslim Brotherhood and he would support Islamic State. But at least publicly, he denounces both of these organizations. So I think that's the right stand there, and he's not being just one who supports anyone who is Sunni and denounces anyone who is Shia. Going back a little bit, in April of 2016, in terms of his economic beliefs, he launched what's called the Vision 2030. After he took control of the economy, where he aims to, by 2013, have a more diversified and privatized structure. So privatization is something in parallel to Mark Rutte. As in terms of diversification, the country is very, very heavily reliant on oil. So they're also moving into renewables. They actually have started their first ever nuclear plant, and they hope to have 16 nuclear facilities over the next 20 years. They have put $6.7 billion into a high-speed railway line from Medina to Mecca, which are the two most religious centers in Saudi and perhaps in the whole Muslim world. But I think this is obviously, I think it's nice. I think it's good. It'll create a lot of jobs. I think infrastructure is hugely important. But from a religious standpoint, once again, I think MBS is very much more modern and less of a religious end here. And the concept of the pilgrimage to Mecca is to walk it. So I think if people are just riding a high-speed train on their pilgrimage to Mecca, I think it's almost like cheating. I assume people will still walk, but I just think it's a little bit funny and a little bit counterintuitive. The point of the pilgrimage is, well, firstly, it's already gotten so much easier now. A lot of people just drive their cars to Mecca. But the point of a pilgrimage is, and it doesn't have to be Mecca, but the point is in the religious text in the Quran is that one must leave their home and go on a journey and for spiritual awakening. So riding a high-speed train to Mecca, if you're going there for other reasons, that's okay, but I don't think that would, if you ride a high-speed train, a $6.7 billion route, it would count as a religious excursion. Some of his other policies are he has decreased the powers of the religious police, which once again brings it back to the fact that I think he's less of religious focus than he is focused on other things. So I think that is a step in the right direction. I think that personally, I don't think there should be any religious police, despite the importance of religion globally. I just think that religion and government should always maintain as separate as possible. With his father, they first created a policy where allowing women to drive, which is very a step forward, but once again outlines how far they still have to go if women can't even drive cars. That's obviously quite an issue. He allowed comedy, professional wrestling events, and monster truck rallies with the Entertainment Authority. So moving forward to once again diversifying entertainment, but also showing some you could consider them Western values, because I think he's been very much inspired by the United States particularly, but also Western entertainment. So he's bringing that there, and unlike perhaps more conservative leaders, he is open to sharing with his people that which he's experienced globally. He has approved of a scheme to allow foreigners to own property and invest in the kingdom, and he's famous for giving a green card to a famous journal. So formerly, no foreigner or expatriate was allowed to own any property in Saudi, so he's very much opening the economy. This is obviously, from a nationalist perspective, could be worrisome. One might say, oh, the foreigners will eventually start owning all of Saudi Arabia. For example, Saudi Arabia, they say, owns almost a third of the London in the United Kingdom. But I think the confidence that it brings, allowing international investments and the ownership of property, will bring further economic prosperity generally, not only to Saudi Arabia, but the region. He's, in 2017, he allowed for the first woman head of the Saudi Arabian Stock Exchange, so a very important role gone to a woman, which is once again a very good step in the right direction. In 2018, women could legally own businesses without a male's permission, which is also, and perhaps an even more important step. We'll start seeing some great entrepreneurs, and as we have already seen, some great entrepreneurs starting to come out of Saudi Arabia for this reason. With going back to some of the criticisms, the two embargoes on the embargo on Yemen, despite him trying to crack down on the Houthis, who I do think are a violent militant group, it is very much hurting the general people of Yemen. Similarly, their embargo against Qatar has been compared to the U.S. embargo on Cuba, and if any of you've been to Cuba, I've been to Cuba. It's very the economy still hasn't recovered. Their cars are super old. It's like going back in time, going to Cuba, just being held off from the trade with the United States. However, MBS has denounced this, saying that it's not like a U.S.-Cuba relationship because Qatar is smaller than a Cairo street. So he sees Qatar as quite insignificant and just really wants to crack down. The reason why there is an embargo between Saudi Arabia on Qatar is that he claims that Qatar supports terrorists. Almost all countries in the Middle East have agreed to this embargo and also have engaged in the embargo against Qatar. The two exceptions are that Turkey and Iran support Qatar by helping them with airspace and diplomatic supporters and food as well. The intermediary right now, worth mentioning, is Bahrain, who is sort of a neutral party. However, other party, even Yemen, who Saudi Arabia and SBS have an embargo against, are against Qatar as well, and the UAE, which is considered one of the more liberal countries as well in the regions, is also against the Qatar. So perhaps it might be true that they truly are financing and supporting terrorists. But I think maybe it's the wrong measure, because I think it's hurting the general population more than it might be hurting the terrorists. In October of 2018, the probably most recent news story with major news story with Saudi Arabia is the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a political critic of MBS as well as the Saudi government as a whole, and he was assassinated in Saudi Arabia, supposedly by MBS's personal bodyguard. Donald Trump said it was one of the worst cover-ups in the history of cover-ups. And in the aftermath, MBS declared that he would kill 5 people found guilty of this. So I think the aftermath was almost worse than the original crime. Just to remedy killing by more killing, I think, is wrong. Even if they are fully responsible, I don't think that is a reason to kill 5 people for one. perhaps it would be just better to publicly shame them if they even are guilty and if he himself is not guilty. Obviously, if this is true, if he did have a part in this assassination of a journalist, that is very morally wrong and criminal of him. In 2019, he defended Xi Jinping's re-education camps for Muslims. So as we'll see in the documentary on China, China has a very large Muslim minority in the West, where the vast majority of Chinese are engaging in quite racist acts and trying to destroy their religion and as well re-educate them. So surprisingly, MBS actually supports Xi Jinping's stance, saying here that China has the right to carry out anti-terrorism and de-extremization work for its national security. So you would have thought, as a leader of a major Muslim country, he would support the Muslims in China, but instead he supports the non-Muslim majority in China, suppressing the Muslim minority. So I think that's a very interesting thing to note, and once again proves that he isn't necessarily a major religious adherent, but more focused on the actual national concerns. Another one, I'm not sure where he stands on it, but in Kashmir, there's a Muslim minority in India where as we saw, Modi has been really cracking down on, not necessarily him, but at least allowing it and cutting off their communication. Similarly, in his province, Modi's province, while he was governor, we've seen a lot of, I would say, crimes done towards Muslims in both India and China. It would be interesting to see whether, once again, MBS supports the Modi or he defends the Muslim minority in Kashmir. But he has not publicly spoken on this. But once again, less focused on religion, but more focused on actual things outside of religion. In terms of his personal life, he is worth $3 billion, which is very, very wealthy. But for a king of such a major country as Saudi Arabia, it's not actually that wealthy. We have people in the private sector who are wealthier. But I think in effect, you could say, if once he becomes king, I think in all intents and purposes, almost the entire GDP will be his. So sure, on paper he might only be worth $3 billion, but how much capital does he have at his disposal? Well, probably the entirety of Saudi Aramco, which is the entirety of the oil supply. So it's a lot. For example, the richest man in the world today is Jeff Bezos. Even though Jeff Bezos is multitudes richer than MBS, I think we could still, on paper, say that MBS is richer because he controls the world's oil prices. He controls essentially one of the most powerful country I think we could agree on in the Middle East. Maybe Israel, one might consider to be slightly more powerful just through their network. However, he is incredibly powerful and definitely more powerful than anyone in the private sector. He has a $500 million yacht, which he bought from a European vodka billionaire named the yacht's name is Serene. In 2015, he bought Chateau Louis XIV for $300 million. He bought, supposedly, there was a little bit of a dispute here, Salvador Mundi, which is a painting supposedly done by Da Vinci, for a record price for any art sale for $450.3 million for a painting. That's absolutely incredibly lot of money for a painting. But the UAE claims that it is the owner, and the seller of it claims that it hasn't been sold. However, its location is unknown, so maybe he did buy it. But nonetheless, perhaps he has an appreciation for art, or at least the clout behind it, and perhaps maybe I think it could be seen as an investment or a belief in the value of the West. If he saw that, for example, Da Vinci was just a random guy and of no significance, he would not be willing to pay that much money. He has met with Mark. He met with Mark Zuckerberg in the Silicon Valley in 2016, where he learned more about how he could modernize his own economy. He has also met with almost every famous person that you could think of, from Oprah to Richard Branson to Jeff Bezos to Bill Gates to both the Bushes. Pardon me. So he's met with almost everyone, and you could almost say it was other people have been fortunate to have met him. So he married his cousin Sarah bint Mashur bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. So keeping it in the family, which I think is not necessarily a good thing, generally speaking, but from his standpoint, to maintain and keep the power tight, I see why he might have done this. And he married her in 2008, so relatively recently, and he has 4 children with her. So quickly to the quotes that we have not covered yet. We have covered all the quotes. But just to go back, to confirm, no one will survive the corruption case, whoever he is, even if he's a prince or minister. That was his house arrests he did at the Ritz-Carlton for wealthy business owners. If we weren't for America's cultural influence, we would have ended up like North Korea. Once again, his perhaps respect for the West and private corporations. Turkey is part of the triangle of evil alongside Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood, as mentioned previously, but once again showing that his political decisions are not driven by religion. And I believe the Palestinians and Israelis have the right to have their own land, which is, I think, something that I do believe in. I think we'll really delve into this more in the Benjamin Netanyahu video, which will be coming soon, and I think maybe his most morally correct decision. Here is the flag of Saudi Arabia. The population of Saudi Arabia is 33.7 million, almost double the size of the Netherlands, which has 17.28 million. The GDP is 786.5 billion. So despite the two countries, the Netherlands and Saudi Arabia, being right next to each other in terms of size on the list of most major countries, there's a big jump between the Netherlands and Saudi Arabia by almost 100 or over 100 billion. And the area is much, much larger than the Netherlands at 2.15 million kilometers squared compared to 41,000. So much, much larger, twice the population, multitudes higher in area. However, the GDP is, interestingly enough, slightly smaller. Perhaps it's because it's just harder or less countries have faith or trust investing in Saudi Arabia when formerly other countries couldn't even get ownership for assets in Saudi Arabia, and a lot of it is in effect unsecured assets because MBS can just take it. The oil assets are essentially fictitious prices, so it's very, very hard to measure as well. But MBS is a very, very powerful individual, and the GDP figure probably doesn't even capture it. The symbols, here is the seal of Riyadh. Here is the symbol of the government of Saudi Arabia. Interestingly enough, if you were to take this, which is a tree and 2 sabers, if you made a gold and put it right on the flag of Saudi Arabia, it becomes the flag of the king of Saudi Arabia, which will very soon be MBS's. This is the flag of his university that he went to. This is the symbol of Saudi Aramco, and this is the symbol of his campaign Vision 2030, where he hopes to completely redesign the economy of Saudi Arabia by the year 2030. So with respect to the comparison between Mark Rutte and MBS, they both really hope to modernize their economies by moving towards privatization. So both these countries have a history where the government has had almost, we could say, too much control. MBS has maybe been a bit slower in giving it up, but the Netherlands, from a relative standpoint compared to perhaps the States, is very, very much a welfare state, very, very much more socialist. So they both have very much moved to engage in further international trade and much efforts in terms of modernizing their economies, also particularly with respect to technology. They both have been successful mostly through their coalitions. In the Netherlands, it's almost a given because no one can form government without a coalition, so the VVD party has been very successful in forming coalitions, and particularly Mark Rutte has been successful in doing this. But similarly, MBS has been very successful in forming coalitions with other countries in the Middle East, making Saudi Arabia the de facto leader, I would say, of many of the Middle Eastern countries, and for also being quite capable in turning them against other countries, turning them against Qatar, turning them against Turkey, turning them against Iran. He's been very, very effective in that stance. Lastly, they both have been relatively tough with respect to the United States. Mark Rutte would cut off continuously Donald Trump and disagree with him openly, whereas MBS did a similar thing with Obama, which I think obviously I think is normal dialogue would be ill-mannered. However, if you are the leader of a state or soon to be king, I think that's part of your responsibility to speak up and not to be a pushover. So similar in that respect. But from in terms of differences, I think there are more ways they are different than they are alike, and we must distill where they are similar, because that is the essence of a leader. I guess what a leader is fundamentally is the commonalities or the distillations between all the great leaders, and their essentially it would be an archetype of them. So their similarities are what makes them more important. But to quickly talk about the differences, and I don't want to go too much into them, one came to the position through birthright, whereas the other evidently just essentially climbed by being I think we could call him a very good people person, human resources department throughout his whole career, staying with a similar corporation, moving subsidiary to subsidiary, and moving his party up to be the first liberal prime minister in the country's history, or since in 92 years. Other ways they're different. I guess Rutte has no family. MBS does have a family. However, you could make the argument that MBS might have been forced to have a family with his cousin anyways. So, and to what extent is he that committed towards his family is up to dispute as well. But both of them, I think, are very representative of where the globe is moving today. I think that the European Union is starting to move towards, firstly, privatization, but also slowly the countries are starting to, at least with respect to Mark Rutte and some of the other leaders we've discussed, to become less accepting of immigration, and I think that is something also that Mark Rutte demonstrates, whereas MBS definitely shows that the Middle East, although there have been Arab Springs and many recent conflicts, that power is starting to consolidate. I think that it is starting to become clear that Saudi Arabia does run the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, another major player in Turkey, but Turkey is kind of in the middle. But the power is starting to consolidate, and the only ones to oppose them are really these smaller terrorist organizations, such as the Houthis or Islamic State, and they are almost proving to be tools with which the countries of the Middle East are becoming more powerful. So if anything, these two leaders are, I think, very much representative, mostly because of their significance, but representative of where the world is going. So that's personally how I like to learn. I like to learn about people. I like learning about things as well, but I think that through learning about people is perhaps the best way of learning about the world, because they are manifestations of the world that they experience and that they create. So at least that works for me, and I hope if you're watching this or listening to this, you agree the same. So thank you so much for watching or listening to this, and I hope you watch or listen to something else that I produce in the future or I have made in the past. Thanks so much.